I took part in an experimental therapy for PTSD on the dark web. Now, I'm reliving memories that aren't mine. Okay, this whole thing is going to sound insane, but I swear, everything I'm about to tell you actually happened. You know how people always joke about not going too deep into the dark web? Well, they're not kidding. If I could take back everything I saw there, I would. But it's too late now. It started a few months back. I'd been dealing with PTSD for a while, and nothing was working. I tried therapy, meds, meditation, all the normal stuff, and I was getting desperate. The nightmares, the flashbacks, they just wouldn't stop. I could barely sleep, and when I did, it was like my mind was determined to show me every horrible thing I'd ever seen, over and over again. One night, I was in this forum for PTSD support, just looking for someone who might know what it was like, when I saw a comment that caught my eye. The username was random, just a string of numbers and letters, but what they said made me stop. If you're serious about getting rid of PTSD, there's an experimental treatment. It's not legal, exactly, but I tried it, and I haven't had a flashback since. The idea of anything experimental didn't exactly sit right with me, especially on some anonymous forum. But there was something desperate about the way they wrote it, like they really understood what it was like to be haunted by your own mind. So, I DM'd them, asking for details. They responded with a single link. No explanation, no encouragement, just a link that led to a site on the dark web. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the mouse, but then another nightmare flashed in my mind, and I clicked. The site was blank, except for a single sentence in bold black text. Wipe your mind clean. Ready? Underneath, there was a button that said, Enter, and my heart started pounding. I told myself it was just a website. What harm could it do? Besides, I was desperate for anything that might work, anything to make the nightmares stop. I clicked Enter. The screen changed to a list of options for treatments. Each one was vague and weirdly named. Things like dream drainer, memory sync, and eidetic therapy. I had no clue what any of it meant, and there were no descriptions, just tiny purchase buttons next to each one. I almost closed the window then and there, but something kept me scrolling, and that's when I saw it. Memory reversion therapy. The description was short, just a few lines in broken English. It promised to remove traumatic memories by rewiring the pathways in the brain, replacing them with neutral memories. I wasn't sure how it was supposed to work, and it sounded sketchy as hell, but I couldn't shake the idea that maybe this was my last shot. The price was steep, way more than I could really afford. But before I knew it, I'd clicked purchase, filled out some basic info, and hit submit. Almost instantly, I got an email with a link to download a program and some vague instructions. It said the program would run overnight and unlock suppressed memories. Something about that wording felt off, but I'd already paid, so I decided to give it a shot. Worst case scenario, it wouldn't work, right? That night, I downloaded the program, set it up like the instructions said, and lay down on my bed with my laptop nearby, watching the strange code scrolling across the screen. The instructions said to keep the screen visible, but not to look directly at it while I was falling asleep. Apparently, the program worked best in peripheral vision, like it was supposed to sink into the subconscious. I'll be honest, I felt pretty ridiculous. But as I lay there, I started to feel strange. My eyelids felt heavy, like I was slipping into a deep, dreamless sleep. But at the same time, I could almost feel my mind being pulled somewhere else, like my thoughts were being tugged in different directions. I chalked it up to exhaustion and let sleep take me. Then, the dream started. At first, they were just flashes, random images and sounds, like old memories playing out in fast forward. None of it made any sense, but they weren't the usual nightmares. In fact, they didn't even feel like my memories. They were too vivid, too foreign. I saw places I'd never been, people I didn't recognize, conversations I'd never had. And then it got stranger. In one of the dreams, I was standing in a dark room with peeling wallpaper, the air thick with a smell I couldn't place. I looked down and saw my hands, but they didn't look right. They were rough, scarred, like they belonged to someone who'd lived a hard life. And in that moment, I knew I wasn't myself. I was someone else, somewhere else, in a memory that wasn't mine. That night, I tried to stay awake, but the exhaustion was overwhelming. It was like the program was draining me, pulling me back into that dark, twisted version of my own mind. Eventually, I couldn't fight it anymore, and as soon as I closed my eyes, I was back in that dark room with the peeling wallpaper, standing over the woman tied to the chair. Only this time, it felt different, sharper. I could feel every detail, the worn wood under my feet, the faint smell of mildew in the air, the woman's terrified breathing filling the silence. But the worst part was the overwhelming urge I felt, this dark, unexplainable rage bubbling up from deep inside me. I didn't want to feel it, but it was like I was trapped, a passenger in someone else's mind, feeling their thoughts, their anger. And just as I was about to reach out, just as my hand moved toward her, I snapped awake. My heart was pounding, my face drenched in sweat. I stumbled to the bathroom, splashing water on my face, trying to shake the lingering sensation of that rage, that other person's emotions clinging to me like oil. But even as I stood there, staring at my reflection, I felt it. The anger, the bitterness. It was still there, simmering beneath the surface, as if some part of that person's mind had embedded itself in me. Over the next few days, the memories started coming more frequently, not just at night, but in random flashes. I'd see faces, hear snippets of conversations, catch glimpses of places I'd never been. And it was always the same, a series of fragmented moments, each one piecing together the life of someone else. Someone dark, someone dangerous. One morning, I woke up with a sharp pain in my shoulder, a throbbing ache that seemed to radiate down my arm. When I looked, there was a faint scar there, a small, jagged line I'd never seen before. I racked my brain, trying to remember if I'd injured myself, but nothing came to mind. It was like the scar had just appeared, as if it had belonged to the person whose memories I was living through, etched into my skin. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, that this was just some elaborate nightmare my mind was creating. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more real it became. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was becoming someone else, that the memories weren't just showing me someone's life, they were changing mine. Desperate, I tried reaching out again to the email support address from the dark website. I begged them to give me some kind of solution, a way to turn off the program and get my life back. A day passed, then two, with no response. And then finally, I got an email back. It was short, only 2 words. Session irreversible. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Irreversible? What did that mean? Was I stuck with these memories forever? I tried replying, begging for more information, but my email bounced back. The address was gone. That night, the dreams were worse than ever. This time, I was back in that familiar dark room, but the memory had changed. I wasn't alone. I was standing with the man from the bus stop, the one with the scar across his cheek. He was talking to me, but his words were muffled, blurred, like I was listening through water. And then he stopped speaking. looking me dead in the eyes with this cold, calculating stare. "You're in too deep now," he said, his voice low and chilling. "Once you've seen, there's no going back." I jolted awake, gasping for air, feeling that same cold dread settling in my chest. The line between reality and memory was blurring, and I couldn't tell if it was a dream or if I'd actually spoken to him, if he was somehow reaching through these memories to talk to me. Over the next few days, my reality kept fracturing. People I didn't know started recognizing me on the street, giving me nods or strange, knowing looks. I'd pass alleyways and feel an overwhelming urge to walk down them, like I was being drawn somewhere, like this other life was pulling me in, dragging me deeper into its story. One night, I heard footsteps outside my apartment. I peered through the peephole, and there, in the hallway, was the man with the scar. He wasn't alone this time. Two other figures stood behind him, their faces shadowed, but I could feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting. I backed away, my heart pounding, but a thought crossed my mind that sent a chill down my spine. What if they weren't just figures from someone else's memories? What if they were real? And what if, somehow, they were coming for me? I locked the door, turned off the lights, and waited, barely breathing, as the footsteps faded down the hall. But deep down, I knew they'd be back. And the worst part? Some part of me wanted to let them in. After that night, it became clear that the memories had somehow breached the boundary between dreams and reality. They were blending into my life, reshaping everything I thought I knew. I stopped going out as much, feeling like every time I stepped outside, I was in danger of being pulled further into that other world. And worst of all, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I turned a corner, every time I passed a dark alley, I felt those eyes on me. I didn't see the man with the scar again, but I'd catch glimpses of other faces. The kid with the baseball cap, the woman with the piercing blue eyes, people who didn't belong to my world, but felt as familiar as if they'd always been part of it. Sleep became a battle. The memories were coming back in longer stretches now, each one bleeding into the next. They weren't just dreams anymore. They were pieces of a life I was starting to know better than my own. I'd see flashes of ordinary moments, the smell of cigarette smoke in a cramped room, the hum of a fan, the ticking of an old clock. Each detail was so vivid that I could practically feel the worn fabric of a couch, hear the dull murmur of voices in the next room. Then came the darker memories. One night, I was back in that old apartment, sitting across from the scarred man. He was talking, his voice low and gruff, like he was confiding something he'd never told anyone else. I couldn't make out his words, but I felt his anger, his desperation, as if it was my own. And then he leaned forward, his hand resting on the table between us. In the memory, I looked down and saw a gun. It was old, worn, with scratches along the barrel. I felt my hand reach out, wrapping around the handle, the weight of it cold and heavy. And as I held it, I felt a surge of rage, a twisted satisfaction that didn't belong to me. I woke up with a start, my heart racing, the feeling of the gun still lingering in my hand. But when I looked down, there was nothing there, just my empty, trembling hand. Over the next few days, I started seeing more fragments of that life, details I didn't want to know. I saw a confrontation in a dimly lit bar, voices raised, fists clenched. I saw the scarred man shoving someone against the wall, his face twisted in anger, and I felt that same dark satisfaction, the same thrill. It was like I was being shown a version of myself that didn't exist, a version I didn't want to know. I kept trying to remind myself that these weren't my memories, that they belonged to someone else. But the more I experienced, the harder it became to tell where he ended and I began. It was like my mind was being overwritten, one memory at a time. Then one day, something happened that shattered any hope I had of holding on to my own reality. I was out for a walk, trying to clear my head, when I passed by an old pawn shop. I'd never been in there before, but something made me stop. A feeling, almost like déjà vu, pulled me toward the door. Without thinking, I went inside. The place smelled like old wood and metal, and the air was thick with dust. I wandered down the aisles, barely aware of what I was doing, until I stopped in front of a glass case. And there, sitting among a jumble of odds and ends, was the gun from my dream. I stared at it, feeling the blood drain from my face. It was exactly as I'd seen it, the same worn grip, the same scratches along the barrel. My hand hovered over the glass, an urge to touch it, to hold it, as if some part of me knew it was mine. "Something catch your eye?" the shopkeeper asked, his voice snapping me out of my trance. I mumbled something, shaking my head, and hurried out of the shop. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd seen something real, that I'd somehow crossed paths with the life I'd been reliving. It was like the memories were leaking into the real world, leaving traces of themselves everywhere I went. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see that gun, feel its weight in my hand, hear the low, gruff voice of the scarred man echoing in my mind, and then, just as I was starting to drift off, I felt something cold and solid press into my hand. I jolted awake, sitting up in bed, my heart pounding. There was nothing there, but the sensation lingered, as real as if I'd actually been holding the gun. The days that followed were a blur. I stopped going outside, stopped eating, stopped talking to anyone. I was too afraid of what I might see, too afraid that I'd run into one of the people from those memories, and they'd recognize me, see that I was somehow part of their world now. Every night, I'd fall into those memories, reliving each moment with a clarity that was both horrifying and mesmerizing. And then, the final memory came. In this memory, I was back in the apartment, standing over the scarred man as he lay slumped in a chair, his eyes vacant and lifeless. My hand was wrapped around the gun, smoke still curling from the barrel. I felt a strange, hollow satisfaction, an emptiness that filled me with a deep, aching dread. I knew, in that moment, that he was dead, that I'd killed him. But it didn't feel like a dream. It felt real, like I was standing there in my own body, holding the gun in my hand, staring down at the man I'd just murdered. When I woke up, I was drenched in sweat, my hands trembling. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd actually been there, that I'd somehow crossed over into that memory, into that life. I looked down, half expecting to see the gun in my hand, to see blood on my fingers. But there was nothing, just the empty room, the quiet darkness pressing in around me. I knew then that I couldn't keep going like this. The memories were taking over, consuming me, erasing who I was piece by piece. I needed to find a way to end it, to break free from whatever I'd unleashed. So, that night, I went back to the dark web. The site was still there, still the same blank page with a single line of text. Wipe your mind clean. Ready? I stared at the screen, my hand hovering over the keyboard, and typed out a single desperate message. I want out. I hit send, my heart pounding, and waited. For a long time, nothing happened. Just silence, the blank screen staring back at me like it was mocking me. But then, a new message appeared. Once you enter, you cannot leave. I felt a wave of dread wash over me, but I refused to give up. I typed out another message, begging, pleading for them to let me go, to take the memories back, but the response was the same. The session is irreversible. You wanted to forget. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the screen, feeling that sinking realization settle in. There was no escape, no way out. The memories were mine now, forever etched into my mind, a part of me that I couldn't erase. And as I sat there, feeling the weight of that truth, I heard a voice, low and raspy, echoing in the back of my mind. You're one of us now. I shut my laptop, my hands shaking, the darkness pressing in around me like a heavy, suffocating weight. I could still feel the memories lingering, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment I'd let them take over completely. And now, I don't know who I am anymore. In the days that followed, I could barely recognize my own life. Every corner of my mind felt invaded, tainted by someone else's memories, and it was getting harder to remember who I was before all of this. I'd see my reflection in the mirror, and it was like looking at a stranger, someone who carried a darkness in their eyes that didn't belong to me. I tried to distract myself, to lose myself in TV, music, anything to drown out the noise in my head. But even in those moments, the memories would creep back in, filling my mind with vivid flashes of that other life. It was like an infection, spreading further each day, rooting itself into my thoughts, my feelings, until I couldn't tell where my mind ended and his began. I started to notice little things, unsettling details that only made the feeling worse. Sometimes I'd catch myself saying things that weren't mine, phrases I'd never use, words that felt wrong on my tongue. Other times, I'd go to reach for something and realize that my hand was shaking, not out of fear, but from a kind of lingering rage that didn't feel like mine. Then, one night, I found something that shattered whatever illusion I had left. I was sorting through some old boxes in my closet, looking for a journal I used to keep, thinking maybe if I read my own words from before all of this, it would help me reconnect with who I was. Instead, buried deep in one of the boxes, I found an envelope. It was sealed, marked only with the initials MR, the same initials as the man with the scar. I froze, staring down at the envelope, my heart racing. Part of me wanted to toss it, to throw it in the trash and pretend I'd never seen it, but I couldn't. My fingers trembled as I tore it open, pulling out a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was familiar, a messy scrawl that I somehow knew belonged to him. The note was short, but the words hit me like a punch to the gut. If you're reading this, it's too late. You've become me. Finish what I couldn't. I stared at the note, my mind racing, trying to understand what it meant. Finish what I couldn't. The words looped in my head, leaving me with a sinking feeling that whatever I'd gotten myself into was more than just memories. It was a legacy, his legacy, that was seeping into my mind, compelling me to do something I didn't understand. But the most disturbing part, some part of me felt drawn to it. That night, I tried not to sleep, but eventually the exhaustion took over. As soon as I closed my eyes, I was back in his world, back in that dingy apartment. I was standing by the window, looking out over a rain-soaked street, feeling a sense of purpose, a strange determination that wasn't mine. And then, like clockwork, the scarred man appeared, his face half hidden in the shadow, his eyes hard and calculating. "Are you ready to finish what I started?" he asked, his voice low and steady. I tried to speak, to tell him I didn't want any part of this, but my mouth wouldn't move. It was like I was locked in his mind, his thoughts blending into mine, controlling me from within. I could feel his anger, his sense of revenge. It was all so intense, so overpowering, and I realized, with a sickening dread, that I didn't just know his memories. I was starting to want what he wanted. I woke up in a cold sweat, feeling like I was going to be sick. The line between his memories and my own was gone, dissolved into this strange, twisted connection that was pulling me deeper, filling me with emotions that didn't belong to me. And the worst part? I was beginning to understand them, to feel his reasons, his hatred. The following night, I locked myself in my room, desperately trying to keep myself awake, but the pull of sleep was too strong. As soon as I drifted off, I found myself walking through an old alleyway, rain pouring down around me, the smell of damp concrete and cigarettes filling the air. I knew where I was going, knew the exact path to take, even though I'd never been there before. I ended up at the back door of an old, run-down building, my hand reaching out to push it open. Inside, the air was thick with tension, and I could hear muffled voices coming from somewhere nearby. The voice of the scarred man echoed in my mind, urging me forward, telling me that this was the final piece, the part he'd been waiting for me to see. In the dream, I walked down a narrow hallway, my footsteps echoing off the peeling walls. I turned a corner, and there in front of me was a door marked with the same initials that were on the envelope, MR. I pushed it open, and inside, I saw a scene that made my blood run cold. The room was empty, except for a single chair, a notebook lying open on the floor beside it. But it wasn't the chair or the notebook that caught my attention. It was the wall behind them. There, scrawled in red, were the words, "Finish what I couldn't." I woke up gasping, clutching my chest, feeling that same heavy sense of inevitability pressing down on me. I knew what he wanted me to do now, knew the twisted revenge he hadn't lived long enough to complete, and somehow, some part of me felt compelled to carry it out, like I owed it to him, like it was my responsibility. I don't know if I'm losing myself, or if he's becoming a part of me, but the line is gone now. His memories, his desires, they're tangled up with mine, indistinguishable, like two lives merging into one. I see his face when I look in the mirror, hear his voice in the back of my mind, telling me that this isn't over, that I can't stop until his legacy is complete. And the scariest part? I don't think I want to stop. I spent the next few days drifting in and out of a haze, my mind slipping between my memories and his, like two lives tangled together in a mess I couldn't unravel. Every time I tried to focus on something familiar, a friend, a favorite song, a memory from my own life, it felt like sand slipping through my fingers. His memories, his emotions, were overwhelming mine, taking up more space in my mind than I ever thought possible. And it was all building towards something. I could feel it, a pressure that was growing, pushing me toward a final act, one that would bring his story to an end. That phrase, "Finish what I couldn't," echoed in my head day and night, a relentless beat that wouldn't let up. I stopped leaving my apartment. It wasn't safe out there, not with those faces I kept seeing, people who seemed to know who I was, or who I was becoming. But being locked inside wasn't much better. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, pressing me deeper into his memories. I could barely tell what was real anymore. I didn't even know if my actions were my own, or if I was just a puppet, acting out his final steps. Then, one night, it happened. I was sitting in the dark, trying to keep my mind blank when I felt it. The pull, that insistent urge to go somewhere, to finish something. My body moved almost on its own, numb and automatic, as I grabbed my jacket and left the apartment. I walked down the empty streets, the world around me blurring, fading away, until it was just me and this dark, endless drive pulling me forward. I ended up in front of a rundown building I didn't recognize, but somehow I knew I'd been here before. In his memories, this was the place he'd failed, the place where his life had ended too soon to fulfill whatever he'd come here to do. I felt my feet carry me up the steps, through the door, down a dim hallway that stretched out like a tunnel. The building was empty, dark, the only sound, the distant hum of an old light flickering somewhere above me. I felt the weight of his anger settle over me, this cold, relentless rage filling my veins, guiding my steps, and then I reached a door at the end of the hall. I pushed it open, my pulse racing, feeling like I was watching myself from somewhere far away. The room was empty except for an old, scarred table and a chair that sat under a single dangling light. There, resting on the table, was a small, leather-bound notebook. My hand moved toward it, and before I knew it, I was flipping through the pages, his voice echoing in my head, growing louder with every word I read. The notebook was filled with details, plans, addresses, names. All the pieces of a life he'd built around revenge, one that had been cut short before he could see it through. Each page was a step in his mission, each note scrawled with the kind of single-minded fury that could only come from a lifetime of anger. And in that moment, I understood everything. His story, his purpose, his unfinished business. It was like something clicked inside me, a final lock opening. And suddenly, I felt calm, clear. It was as if I'd become him, fully and completely. His memories fusing with mine, his rage and purpose flooding through me, until I couldn't tell where he ended and I began. I don't remember much of what happened after that. The rest is just flashes, fragmented moments that play in my mind like scenes from a movie. I remember walking through the city, following the path laid out in the notebook. My mind a blur of his thoughts and mine, no longer separate. I remember reaching the door of an old, worn-out apartment, knocking, and feeling that same sense of dark purpose surge inside me as the door opened. The last thing I remember is standing in front of a mirror, looking at my own reflection, but it wasn't me staring back. It was him, his hollow eyes, his cold, calculating expression, the scar across his cheek that felt as familiar as if I'd borne it my whole life. And now, here I am, back in my own apartment, but everything feels different. My memories, my own life, they're distant, foggy, like they belong to someone else. It's his life that feels real, his memories that are sharp and clear, filling every corner of my mind. Sometimes I catch a glimpse of myself in the mirror, and I almost expect to see him looking back. And sometimes I do. It's in those moments that I feel the strongest pull to finish what he started, to complete the life he never could, because now his life is my life. And somewhere out there, I know there's someone else who remembers who I used to be, someone who will look in the mirror one day and see my reflection staring back. And just like that, his story will live on. I was hired to guard a secret research lab. The patients inside aren't sick, they're experiments. A couple of months back, I got a job offer that sounded, well, almost too good to be true. And looking back, I should have known better. But when you're broke, drowning in bills, and desperate to get out of your dead-end job, you're not exactly picky. The offer came through an agency I'd barely heard of, one of those obscure temp places that operates mostly through online ads. The message was simple. Night security job, high pay, no experience necessary, perfect for someone like me. It seemed straightforward enough. Security gig, watching over some facility at night, keeping an eye on cameras, checking the occasional ID, maybe walking around a couple of times to make sure everything was locked up. Easy, right? So, I sent in my application, thinking I wouldn't even hear back. But the next day I got a call. The voice on the other end was calm, clinical, and to the point. They didn't ask many questions, just verified my name, told me the pay rate, which I'll admit was insanely good for a simple night shift, and asked if I could start immediately. There was one catch, though. "You'll need to sign a non-disclosure agreement," the voice had said. "Everything you see, hear, or experience on site is strictly confidential." It should have been a red flag, but I shrugged it off. Lots of companies require NDAS, especially places that handle sensitive info. And the pay? Well, let's just say it was more than enough to buy my silence. The next night, I was at the address they'd sent me, which turned out to be in the middle of nowhere. The building was this grey, featureless bunker with no windows and barely any signage. Just a single door and a couple of cameras mounted around the perimeter. The whole place had this eerie, lifeless vibe, like it didn't want to be noticed. When I arrived, a guy in a plain uniform, face expressionless, handed me a keycard and led me to a small, dimly lit room with monitors lining one wall. This was the security office. The screen showed feeds from cameras set up around the building, most of which were just long, empty hallways and sterile, white-walled rooms. Before leaving, the guy gave me a quick rundown of my duties. Check the cameras, walk the halls once every hour, and, this part was emphasized, do not enter any of the restricted rooms. Only authorized personnel can enter those areas, he said, his tone dropping. And trust me, you don't want to. He didn't explain what was behind those doors or why they were off limits. Just repeated the rule once more, and then left, the sound of the heavy door echoing behind him. I was alone, left with nothing but the soft hum of the monitors and a lingering sense of unease. My shift started quietly enough. I watched the monitors, occasionally adjusting in my chair or taking a sip of stale coffee. The halls were empty, the rooms silent. For the first few hours, I figured I'd landed the easiest job in the world. Nothing seemed out of place, nothing moved. Just an empty building in the middle of the night. But around 3 a.m., things got strange. I was doing my first walkthrough, moving down one of those sterile, overly bright hallways, when I thought I heard something. It was faint, almost like a low hum or a buzzing, coming from one of the restricted rooms. I paused, straining to listen. The sound was soft but steady, like machinery, or a distant voice echoing through a tunnel. I felt this odd pull, a kind of morbid curiosity. But I remembered the guy's warning and forced myself to keep walking, doing my best to ignore it. But as I continued my rounds, the noise seemed to follow me, echoing through the hallways, always just quiet enough that I couldn't quite make it out. When I got back to the security room, I checked the monitors again, my eyes scanning the feeds for anything unusual. But everything looked the same, just empty halls and closed doors. I sat there, telling myself I was overreacting, that it was just the usual creaks and groans of an old building settling at night. Then, something shifted on one of the screens. I almost didn't notice it at first, but there, in one of the hallway feeds, was a door slowly swinging open. It was one of the restricted doors, the ones I'd been told to stay away from. The door opened just a crack, but it was enough to make my pulse quicken. I leaned closer to the screen, half expecting someone to step out, maybe one of the authorized personnel. But no one came. The door just hung there, slightly ajar, like it was inviting me in. The hum from before was back, louder now, filling the silence of the room. I didn't want to go, every instinct screaming at me to stay put. But something, curiosity maybe, made me get up and walk back down that hall. The hum grew louder as I approached, filling my ears, almost rhythmic, like a heartbeat. I stopped outside the door, the one now cracked open, and peered inside. The room was dimly lit, with this strange, sterile smell hanging in the air. I could barely make out shapes in the shadows, tables, equipment, and something that looked like a hospital bed against the far wall. And then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw it. A figure, sitting in the corner, barely visible in the darkness. It was hunched over, its back to me, breathing heavily. The air felt thick, like every breath was a struggle, and the humming grew louder, filling my head with an uneasy, almost nauseating buzz. I backed away, heart pounding, and hurried back to the security office, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking, my mind racing. I tried to tell myself it was just some experiment, some patient left in the room for the night, but something about it felt wrong. That figure, it hadn't looked like someone who was being treated. It looked trapped, like it didn't belong there. The rest of the shift passed in a blur. I kept glancing at the monitor, half expecting that door to open wider, for that figure to step out into the hallway. But nothing else happened. The hum faded, the doors stayed closed, and when the sun finally rose, I practically sprinted out of there, desperate to put as much distance between myself and that building as possible. I told myself I wouldn't go back, that I'd find another job, something, anything that didn't involve shadowy figures and mysterious hums in the middle of the night. But the pay was good, and curiosity gnawed at me. What kind of place was this? What were they doing there? I returned the next night, and that's when I started to understand. Whatever they were doing in that lab wasn't just research. It was something far darker. Against all common sense, I showed up for my next shift. The day had been filled with dread. Every time I thought about that figure, hunched in the corner of the room, a shiver ran down my spine. But the money was good, and there was this curiosity I couldn't shake. I needed to know what this place was hiding. When I got back, the building felt different. The halls were darker, the quiet somehow heavier. The guy from before, the one who had handed me the key card, wasn't there this time. I was alone. As I settled into the security office, I noticed something odd on one of the monitors. One of the restricted doors was open again, just like the night before. But this time, the door wasn't just cracked. It was wide open, leading into a pitch-black room. My pulse quickened as I stared at the screen, debating whether to check it out or just stay put. And then I heard it, a faint, whispering voice drifting through the hallway. It was soft, almost too low to hear, but it was definitely there, echoing through the silent building. I couldn't make out any words, but the tone was pleading, desperate. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the hall, moving slowly towards the open door. Every step felt heavier, like something was pressing down on me, urging me to turn back. But I kept going, the whispers growing louder, filling the silence with an unnatural hum that made my skin crawl. I reached the door and shined my flashlight into the room. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating what looked like a small, sterile lab. Machines lined the walls, some of them flickering with faint lights, others lying dormant. And then, in the far corner, I saw another figure, strapped to a chair. It was a woman, her head hanging low, her hair covering her face. Her wrists and ankles were bound, and her breathing was shallow, almost non-existent. The whispers seemed to come from her, but her lips weren't moving. I watched, frozen, as the sound filled the room, like a looped recording playing over and over. Please, please, let me out, the voice repeated, soft and broken. I felt a sickening wave of dread. She didn't look like a patient or a test subject. She looked like a prisoner. The whispers grew louder, desperate, filling the room, and I realized they weren't coming from her at all. It was as if the room itself was echoing her thoughts, her pleas for help etched into the air. I wanted to help her, to step forward and undo the restraints, but my body wouldn't move. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to run, to pretend I'd never seen any of this. But as I took a step back, her head lifted, just slightly, and she looked at me. Her eyes were wide and dark, hollow in a way that didn't seem human. She didn't blink, didn't move, just stared at me, her gaze piercing through the darkness. And then, in that same whispering voice, I heard her speak directly to me. They're watching, all of us. The words echoed in my mind, repeating over and over, louder and louder, until it felt like my skull was splitting open. I stumbled back, clutching my head, barely making it out of the room before collapsing against the wall. My breathing was ragged, my heart pounding, and the whispers faded, leaving only silence. I staggered back to the security room, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands shook as I tried to catch my breath, the woman's words echoing in my mind. They're watching all of us. But who were they? And why was she there? I scanned the monitors, half expecting to see her wandering the halls, but the screen showed nothing but empty rooms. The door to her room was closed, as if I'd imagined the whole thing. I kept telling myself that it wasn't real, that it was just my mind playing tricks, but the fear lingered, gnawing at me. For the rest of the night, I sat in that small room, refusing to move. Every now and then, I thought I heard footsteps outside the door, soft and steady, like someone was pacing back and forth. But every time I checked the monitors, the halls were empty. Around 4 a.m., just as I was starting to think I'd made it through the worst of it, the screens flickered. Static filled the monitors, distorting the image, and then one by one, the feeds cut out, leaving only a black screen with a single grainy message scrawled across it. Do not look at them. My breath caught in my throat, my mind racing. Do not look at them. The words burned into the screen, pulsing faintly before the image returned to normal, showing the empty hallways and closed doors. But the whispering was back, filling the room, louder this time, surrounding me. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but it was inside my head, like a swarm of voices buzzing in unison, each one desperate and pleading, each one echoing that same message. They're watching. They're watching. Don't look at them. I spent the rest of the night huddled in that room, too terrified to even glance at the monitors. When morning finally came, I bolted out of there, barely pausing to drop off my keycard. I don't know what I saw that night, or who, or what was in that room. But one thing was clear. Whatever was in that lab, whatever they were doing to those people, it wasn't meant to be seen, and I had a feeling that if I kept coming back, they'd make sure I'd never leave. I didn't want to go back. Every instinct told me to quit and run, but the paycheck kept me from pulling the plug. Bills piling up, and an empty fridge don't leave you with a lot of options. So, against every ounce of common sense, I found myself back at the lab for my next shift, hoping it had all been a stress-induced hallucination. This time, when I walked in, the halls felt even quieter, like the whole building was holding its breath. The usual guy who let me in was nowhere to be found, and the silence was suffocating. I went to the security office, settling in with the monitors, trying to tell myself that I could get through the night if I just stayed in that room. and didn't look at anything I didn't need to. The night started like any other, just me and those dark, empty halls glowing faintly on the screens. The doors stayed closed, the halls stayed empty. I was starting to convince myself it really had all been in my head, but then, just after 2 a.m., something caught my eye. One of the feeds, a camera positioned down a narrow, dark hallway, flickered, the image shifting in and out of static. I leaned closer, squinting, trying to make out what was going on. And that's when I saw it. A shadow moved across the frame, a tall, dark shape that seemed to hover just out of reach of the light. At first, I thought it might be one of the other guards, maybe the guy who'd given me the key card. But as I watched, my stomach twisted. The figure wasn't walking. It was just gliding, as if it were floating, its form flickering and distorting like a bad video feed. I sat frozen, watching as the shadow drifted down the hall, stopping outside one of the restricted doors. It lingered there, like it was waiting. I wanted to look away, to turn off the monitor, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen. After a few seconds, the shadow slipped through the door without opening it, vanishing into the darkness beyond. The monitor flickered, and the door swung open, just a crack. My heart raced. I didn't want to go out there. I wanted to stay locked in the security office, pretending I hadn't seen anything. But that door, hanging open like an invitation, gnawed at me. Against my better judgment, I grabbed the flashlight and opened the office door, stepping out into the hallway. The air felt thicker, colder, the hum of the lights somehow more menacing. I made my way down the hall, stopping a few feet from the open door, the one that shadow had disappeared into. My flashlight barely penetrated the darkness inside, illuminating the faint outline of a room filled with strange equipment, machines that looked like medical devices, but walked, unfamiliar, like they had been pieced together from salvaged parts. And then I saw it. A chair, bolted to the floor in the middle of the room, with thick leather straps attached to the armrests and footrests. It was empty, but something about it made my skin crawl. I could almost imagine someone sitting there, restrained, helpless, watching as that shadow drifted around them. Before I could think better of it, I stepped into the room, the beam of my flashlight sweeping over the walls. That's when I noticed them. Handprints, dozens of them, smeared across the walls in dark stains. They looked like they'd been dragged across the room, desperate, as if people had tried to claw their way out. I backed away, horrified, my breath coming in shallow gasps. And then I heard it, the same whispering from the night before. But this time, it was louder, filling the room with a low, echoing chant that I couldn't understand. It sounded like multiple voices, overlapping, distorted, all speaking in a language that didn't seem human. I stumbled back, almost tripping over the chair, and turned to leave. But just as I reached the door, the whispering stopped, replaced by a single voice, clear, cold, and dripping with malice. "You're not supposed to see this." I spun around, flashlight darting across the room, but there was no one there. Just the empty chair, the smeared handprints, and that dark, unsettling silence. My hands shook as I fumbled with the door, pulling it shut behind me, desperate to put as much distance as I could between myself and whatever was in that room. Back in the security office, I locked the door, my heart still pounding. I tried to steady my breathing, to convince myself that it was over, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. That voice, that shadow, it felt like they were with me, like they'd left something behind in my mind, something dark and invasive. I checked the monitors again, scanning the feeds, hoping to see nothing but empty hallways. But then, On the far left screen, I saw another door open, slowly swinging wide. This time, it was the room at the very end of the hallway, a room I hadn't seen open before. As I watched, another shadow drifted into view, hovering just outside the door, its shape shifting, unnatural. The voice echoed in my head again, a faint whisper this time. "Come closer." I felt a pull, an almost magnetic urge to step out of the office, to follow that shadow down the hall. My fingers gripped the edge of the desk, knuckles white, fighting the compulsion that gripped me. But the pull was strong, an invisible hand reaching into my mind, trying to drag me out of that room. Just when I thought I'd lose the battle, the monitors all went black. Every screen shut off, leaving me alone in pitch darkness. I heard a soft click, and the security office door slowly creaked open. My blood turned to ice. I hadn't unlocked it. I sat there, heart racing, as the darkness pressed in, the feeling of something watching me growing stronger with each passing second. And then, in the shadows, I saw a shape, a tall figure standing just outside the doorway. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, waiting. The voice came back, louder this time, echoing in my head. "You weren't supposed to look." And that's when I realized they weren't watching me on the monitors. They were watching me from the dark. I sat frozen in the security office, staring at the shadowed figure outside the door. My heart hammered in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my body wouldn't listen. I was trapped, held in place by the intensity of its gaze, even though it had no eyes. Just that dark, shifting form that seemed to bleed into the shadows around it. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure moved back, melting into the darkness. I didn't wait to see if it would return. I leapt from my chair, practically stumbling out of the office, desperate to put as much distance between me and whatever that thing was. I was in survival mode, running on pure adrenaline as I bolted down the hall, away from the security office and away from the shadows. But as I turned the corner, I realized something chilling. The building was different. The layout, the doors, the hallways, they weren't where they were supposed to be. It was as if the entire place had shifted, transforming into a maze. I looked around, disoriented, realizing that every hallway looked the same, identical in its sterile whiteness, each one stretching endlessly in either direction. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to pulse and twist. I took a few cautious steps, my footsteps echoing in the silence, feeling like I was being watched from every angle. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. I knew, somehow, that drawing attention to myself in this place was the worst thing I could do. I kept moving, hoping I'd find something familiar, something that would lead me back to the exit. But no matter how far I walked, every turn led me to the same endless hallways, the same doors, each one locked. And then, just as my panic started to boil over, I heard it. The soft hum, that eerie mechanical buzzing that had haunted me since my first shift. I turned, and there at the end of the hallway was another figure. This one wasn't like the shadowy form I'd seen before. It was a person, or something close to one, dressed in a white lab coat, standing perfectly still. Its face was turned toward me, but I couldn't make out any features, just a blank, empty face, like a mannequin's. "Hello?" I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible over the hum. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there motionless, as if it were waiting for me to approach. I took a step back, but as I did, the figure took a step forward, mirroring my movements. I froze, dread pooling in my stomach as it started to advance, each step slow and deliberate. like it was savoring the fear radiating from me. I turned and ran, sprinting down the hall, my shoes pounding against the linoleum, each turn leading me deeper into the labyrinth. But no matter where I went, I could feel it following me, its presence a cold weight that seemed to press down on me from every angle. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I found a door that was slightly ajar. I ducked inside, closing it behind me as quietly as possible, and took a shaky breath, pressing my ear against the wood to listen. Silence. For a moment, I thought I'd lost it. The room was dark, the faint glow of computer monitors casting a dim, eerie light. I scanned the room, my eyes adjusting to the darkness, and saw rows of desks, each one lined with monitors and equipment that looked both advanced and outdated, like something out of a 1980s sci-fi movie. But it wasn't the equipment that caught my attention. It was the rows of photos pinned up on the wall. Each one was a headshot, people of all ages and backgrounds, their faces frozen in expressions of terror, confusion, or desperation. My heart sank as I scanned the faces, realizing that many of them were wearing lab coats, just like the figure in the hallway. But as I kept looking, I spotted something even worse. In the far corner, partially hidden in shadow, was a cluster of new photos. And there, staring back at me, was my own face. The picture was recent, taken sometime within the last day, showing me sitting in the security office, eyes fixed on the monitors. My stomach twisted as I looked at it, realizing that I hadn't seen anyone take that photo. Someone, something, had been watching me the whole time, capturing every moment. I turned away from the wall, fighting the urge to vomit, and that's when I noticed the monitors. They were flickering, cycling through different camera feeds, each one showing a different part of the building. Some of the rooms were familiar, hallways, storage closets, but others were places I'd never seen before. There was a room filled with tanks of murky liquid, each one containing something floating inside, its shape distorted and unnatural. And then, one of the monitors flicked to a new feed, and my blood ran cold. It was showing the room I was in, a live feed from a camera mounted in the corner. I could see myself on the screen, standing frozen in place, watching as a shadow crept along the wall behind me, moving closer with each passing second. I spun around, my flashlight darting across the room, but the shadow was gone. A new message flickered across the screen, grainy letters forming words that sent a chill down my spine. Do not turn around. I froze, heart pounding, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. I could feel something standing behind me, so close I could feel the cold radiating from it, pressing into my back. The message changed, the letters shifting on the screen. They're watching. I took a slow, shuddering breath, and then, against all logic, I turned, and there it was, a figure, standing inches from me, face blank and hollow, its form flickering in and out like a bad transmission. It leaned forward, close enough that I could feel its icy breath on my skin, and in a voice barely louder than a whisper, it said, "Welcome to the experiment." The lights went out, plunging the room into darkness, and I felt something cold and solid wrap around my wrist, pulling me down into the shadows. The darkness swallowed me whole, and in an instant, I was yanked off my feet, pulled into a cold, empty void where sound and light ceased to exist. I gasped, panic surging as I struggled against whatever had a grip on me, my heart racing in a frantic rhythm. The coldness seeped into my bones, numbing me, while the whispering returned, soft, echoing, and insistent, wrapping around me like a shroud. Welcome to the experiment. I felt my body hit the ground hard, the cold floor jolting me back to reality. My eyes flew open, but all I saw was blackness. I scrambled to push myself up, disoriented and terrified. My hands brushed against something rough, metal grating beneath me. I was in a small enclosed space, the air thick and stale. Desperately, I fumbled for my flashlight, managing to turn it on. The beam cut through the dark, revealing a cramped room lined with cold metal walls. There were no windows, no doors, just a single flickering light overhead. I squinted, scanning my surroundings, and that's when I saw it. In the corner of the room stood a table piled with medical instruments, needles, syringes, scalpels, and strange devices I didn't recognize. My stomach churned at the sight, the reality of where I was starting to sink in. This was a lab, a real lab, and I was caught in the middle of whatever twisted experiments they conducted here. I stumbled back, heart pounding, but my escape was cut short when I heard a low humming sound, similar to the one I'd heard before. It filled the room, and the walls vibrated with it, making my teeth rattle. Panic surged through me as I turned in circles, searching for a way out, but the sound was growing louder, more insistent, like it was calling me deeper into the facility. Then suddenly, the humming stopped. Silence enveloped me, oppressive and heavy, and that's when I heard them. Voices, soft and pleading, rising from somewhere below me. I crouched down, pressing my ear to the ground, straining to listen. Help us. Please, let us go. I recognized those voices. They were the same ones I'd heard before, the whispers that had filled the hallways echoing through the dark. My heart sank as the realization hit me. They were trapped here, just like me. The floor creaked, and I scrambled to my feet, shining the flashlight around the room. My breath caught when I spotted a small vent near the ceiling. It was my only chance. I moved quickly, climbing onto the table and reaching up, pushing against the vent cover. It shifted, but didn't budge. With all my strength, I pulled harder, and the cover finally gave way, clattering to the floor. I squeezed myself into the vent, the cold metal biting into my skin as I crawled forward, heart racing, desperate to escape whatever horrors awaited me. The vent was cramped, the air stale and heavy. I could hear the voices clearer now, the muffled sounds guiding me as I crawled deeper into the darkness. But then, the vent shook and I froze, feeling a presence close behind me. I turned my head, and there it was again, a shadow, dark and looming, moving along the outside of the vent, tracking me. I pressed forward, crawling as fast as I could, the space narrowing with every inch. The voices grew louder, more frantic, and I could feel the darkness closing in. I had to keep going, had to get to the end of this tunnel. Just when I thought I'd found a way out, the vent opened up into a larger space. I fell forward, landing in a heap on the ground. I looked around, my flashlight illuminating the room, and what I saw made my blood run cold. This was the heart of the lab. Monitors lined the walls, showing feeds from the security cameras, but they weren't just showing empty hallways. They were filled with people, patients, sitting in darkened rooms, their faces blank and vacant, staring into space. Some were strapped to chairs, others wandered aimlessly, and all of them looked lost, trapped in a nightmare of their own. And then I noticed something else. In the center of the room stood a tall, sterile tank, filled with that same murky liquid I had seen on the monitors before. It pulsed rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat, and as I stepped closer, I could make out the faint outlines of figures floating inside, bodies suspended in the liquid, faces contorted in agony. I stumbled back, horrified. What were they doing here? What had happened to them? The whispers returned, filling the air around me, drowning out my thoughts. I turned to run, but the door behind me swung open, and the figure in the lab coat appeared again, its blank face staring straight at me. "Why did you come here?" it asked, its voice eerily calm. "You shouldn't have looked." I backed away, heart racing, searching for an escape. "I'm not one of them," I shouted, my voice trembling. I just wanted to leave. The figure stepped closer, and the lights flickered, shadows dancing around the room. "You're already part of the experiment. You've seen too much." In that moment, I realized the truth. This wasn't just a lab, it was a prison. The patients weren't sick. They were subjects, part of some twisted experiment that defied explanation. And now, I was trapped in it too. I dashed past the figure, pushing through the door and sprinting down the hallway, ignoring the calls of the voices behind me. I had to get out, had to escape the nightmare this place had become. As I ran, the shadows reached for me, and I could hear the whispers growing louder, echoing my name. I turned a corner, and to my horror, I found myself back in the same hallway I'd started in, the same sterile walls, stretching endlessly before me. Panic surged as I realized I was lost, trapped in an unending loop. I could hear the soft hum returning, filling the air, resonating with my heartbeat. It was closing in on me, filling my mind with dread. In that moment, the reality of what I had stumbled into crashed over me. I was never meant to leave. They were watching me, waiting for me to become just another part of their experiment. With a final burst of adrenaline, I pushed through the nearest door, desperate to escape, and found myself back in the darkened room filled with monitors. The shadows danced around me, and the whispers reached a fever pitch. As I collapsed against the wall, breathless and terrified, I heard the voice again, clear and chilling. "Welcome to the experiment. You're one of us now." And just like that, the lights went out, plunging me into darkness as I felt the shadows close in around me, wrapping me in their cold embrace, forever lost in the maze of horrors that was their creation. I signed up for a drug trial on the dark web. The side effects are worse than they told us. I want to preface this by saying, I know what you're all probably thinking. Why the hell would you sign up for a drug trial on the dark web? Believe me, I've asked myself that question every day since this all started. It wasn't like I'd set out to do something insane or risky. Honestly, it started as something I thought would help out my financial situation without making me leave the comfort of my room. I guess sometimes laziness is what really gets you. It started around 2 months ago. My savings had been eaten up by one emergency after another. You know how it goes. Car problems, bills, random fees. It adds up. I was working a boring call center job, and no matter how much overtime I pulled, it felt like I was treading water. I'm not the type to ask friends or family for money, and trust me, I'd cut every expense down to the bare minimum. I'd heard about paid medical trials before, but the ones around me didn't pay much, and the wait lists were endless. I had nearly given up on the idea when, during one of my long, sleepless nights of doom scrolling, I stumbled onto a random forum thread about high-paying medical trials. Now, this wasn't Reddit or some safe corner of the internet. I don't even know how I ended up on that forum. Maybe an accidental click, maybe a misdirected link, but there I was, reading post after post about these trials that promised to pay thousands for just a couple of weeks of work. Most of the posts were vague and sketchy, but one, in particular, caught my eye. It was titled, "Make $10,000 in 2 weeks from home." Just what I was looking for, right? The author was some guy with a random username, and he claimed he'd made a fortune by participating in this online drug trial. According to him, It was all done remotely, and all you had to do was take a daily dose of the experimental drug, document your symptoms, and send your report back every night. There was a link at the bottom of his post. It was one of those weird, long URLs you can tell doesn't lead anywhere official. But curiosity had its claws in me, and I clicked. I expected a glitchy, sketchy website, but it was surprisingly professional looking. There was a clean, minimalistic page with a dark background and a single question. Are you ready to make $10,000? Staring at it in my dimly lit room, I hesitated. I've always been a cautious person, the kind who thinks twice before crossing the street. But that 10K was almost mocking me. 10,000 bucks just for trying out some pills for a few weeks? Against my better judgment, I typed in my email and clicked submit. Within seconds, I got a reply. It looked like an official email with the subject line, "Welcome to the next-gen drug trial." The message explained that I would receive a package in the next few days containing the drug, labeled simply as Compound 53, along with a set of detailed instructions on dosage and documentation. All they asked was for daily updates through a link provided in the email. It was all very clinical, very straightforward. It even had some legal disclaimer jargon at the bottom, so I figured it had to be legitimate, right? Well, 3 days later, a black box arrived at my door. No return address, no branding. It was about the size of a shoebox, with a heavy, metallic feel. Inside, I found a dark blue pill bottle labeled Compound 53 and a little instruction booklet which laid out the schedule for taking the pills and logging my experiences. Simple enough. They even warned that I might experience mild symptoms like headaches, dizziness, or nausea. Nothing I couldn't handle. I started taking the pills the very next day. The first day, nothing happened. It was just a little blue pill, no bigger than an aspirin, and I felt fine. I even wondered if I'd been scammed. I mean, I'd paid for sketchier stuff on Amazon that didn't deliver. But around day 2, that's when things started feeling off. It began with little things. My vision would blur just a bit after I took the pill, and my hands would shake like I just chugged a Red Bull on an empty stomach. I didn't think much of it at first. I'd read the booklet's warnings and figured, hey, side effects, right? But by day 3, things got stranger. The morning after my 3rd dose, I woke up in the same position I'd fallen asleep in. I hadn't moved an inch. I was flat on my back, arms at my sides, almost like I'd been placed there. It was such an eerie feeling, like I was waking up in someone else's body. But that wasn't the weirdest part. When I glanced in the mirror, I noticed something about my face looked different. I couldn't put my finger on it, but my skin seemed slightly off. Not bruised or red, just different. Brushing it off as sleep deprivation, I went on with my day, trying to ignore this creeping feeling that something wasn't right. I kept waiting for an email from the trial team, or even a message acknowledging I'd started. But all I got was a generic "thank you for your daily submission" email every night. The instructions had told me to take a pill at the same time each day, so I kept going, convincing myself this was just paranoia. It wasn't until day 5 that things took a dark turn. That night, I was lying in bed, just waiting to drift off, when I started hearing this faint tapping sound. It was like someone softly knocking on wood. Tap, tap, tap. My heart started pounding, but I tried to tell myself it was just a branch against the window. I mean, I lived alone, and I'm on the 2nd floor. There's no way anyone could just tap on my window. I lay there, every muscle in my body tense, listening to that persistent tapping. Then, out of nowhere, I heard something else. It was soft at first, almost like a whisper, coming from the hallway outside my room, and as it grew louder, I could have sworn it was my own voice, repeating a single phrase over and over. It's time. I barely slept that night, and when the sun finally rose, I was exhausted and terrified. Still, I took my next pill, told myself I'd drop out of the trial, and logged my entry for the day. But when I went to the website to fill out my report, I found a message waiting for me instead. It was one line, in bold text. You have been chosen. Do not stop. The next day, everything felt wrong. Not just the usual wrongness from the last few days. This was different, heavier. It was as if every part of me had been tampered with, like someone had pulled me apart in my sleep and put me back together, missing a few essential screws. I didn't even remember getting into bed the night before. I just woke up there, sheets perfectly smooth around me, staring up at the ceiling with that message. You have been chosen. Do not stop, playing over and over in my head. I should have quit right then. I should have thrown the pills out, packed a bag and stayed at a friend's place until whatever was happening to me passed. But here's the thing. I felt compelled to continue. Like stopping was never really an option in the first place. Part of me thought maybe it was paranoia, maybe it was just a weird new effect of the drug. Either way, I found myself reaching for the next pill, like it was clockwork. It slid down my throat with a metallic aftertaste I hadn't noticed before, almost like the taste of blood. That's when I heard the whispering again. It started softly, just below the hum of my fridge, barely audible. But this time, I didn't hear it outside my room. It was right next to me, like someone was standing by my shoulder, speaking directly into my ear. I whipped my head around, but there was nothing there. Just the faint echo of words hanging in the air. And worse yet, this time, it wasn't my voice whispering. It was something else, deeper, almost distorted, like a voice that had been dragged through static. I stumbled to my computer to log my report, still shaking. And as soon as I opened the link, I noticed something different. The form wasn't the usual series of bland questions. Instead, the questions had become personal. They weren't asking about symptoms or side effects anymore. They were asking about me. Do you often feel alone? It asked. I stared at it, unsure if this was a new part of the trial or if something had gone wrong with the website. But I typed in yes, figuring maybe they were gathering psychological data or something. Then the next question loaded. Have you ever felt like someone was watching you? That one hit a nerve. I hadn't told anyone about the tapping, the whispering, or the strange feeling that someone or something was lurking just out of sight. But the question felt like it was pulling that knowledge right out of my head, like it already knew. I typed yes again, hands trembling. The final question was a single sentence. Do you trust us? I froze, staring at the words on the screen, trying to make sense of what they were asking. Do I trust who? The faceless administrators behind this trial? The person who'd sent me this black box of pills? I wanted to say no. I wanted to log out, delete my account, and pretend I'd never seen that question. But the mouse wouldn't move. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, and with a mind of their own, they typed out, yes. As soon as I hit enter, the screen flickered and my browser crashed. When I reopened it, the web page was gone, replaced with a 404 not found message. I refreshed it a few times, wondering if I'd just lost connection, but the page stayed broken. My email wasn't showing any new messages from the trial team either. I was locked out, like I'd finished my role in this bizarre experiment. I sat there, staring at the screen, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread pooling in my stomach. My room felt darker, like the shadows had crept closer, watching me, waiting. I shook my head, rubbing my eyes, telling myself it was all in my head. This was just some weird data collection technique, right? They were just testing psychological endurance or something. I mean, that's what these trials were about, testing boundaries. Then, out of nowhere, a loud knock shattered the silence. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks. My heart stopped. I hadn't told anyone I was home, hadn't ordered anything, and didn't know anyone who would visit me unannounced. Slowly, I made my way to the door, my mind racing with every horror scenario imaginable. As I pressed my eye to the peephole, I held my breath, half expecting to see a shadowy figure standing there. But there was no one, just the empty hallway stretching out in both directions. I opened the door a crack, just enough to peek out, but the hallway was empty, no sign of anyone. I stepped out, looking both ways, feeling like I was walking into a trap, but everything was silent. No footsteps, no sound of someone leaving, just a small, thin package lying on the floor, right in front of my door. My name was scrawled on it in thick black letters, but there was no return address, no markings. I didn't want to touch it, but I couldn't help myself. I brought it inside and ripped it open, half expecting more pills or another instruction booklet. Instead, there was a single Polaroid photo. It was a picture of me, sleeping in my bed. In the photo, I was lying on my back, hands at my sides, just like I'd woken up the other morning. My mouth was slightly open, my face relaxed, unaware. But what caught my attention wasn't just the eerie side of my own sleeping face. It was the faint reflection in the mirror behind my bed. A shadowy figure, just barely visible, standing over me, staring down at my sleeping form. I dropped the photo, feeling a scream claw its way up my throat. My entire body was shaking, every nerve on fire. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, a friend, anyone. But just as I dialed, my screen lit up with a notification, a message from the drug trial team. It read, "You're progressing well. Do not stop." I tried to delete the message, to throw my phone across the room, but my hands wouldn't respond. My fingers hovered over the screen, frozen. Slowly, mechanically, they typed a reply. Understood. I watched in horror as the message sent, as if someone else had controlled my hands. My heart was racing, my mind screaming at me to stop, to get out. But all I could do was stare at that last message, my own words staring back at me, confirming that somehow I'd become something I no longer recognized. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat in the corner of my room, clutching my knees to my chest, watching the shadows grow darker and darker around me, waiting for morning to break. And when it finally did, I could have sworn I saw the faint outline of a figure standing by the door, watching me, smiling. By the time morning finally crept through my windows, I'd convinced myself I'd imagined it all. The shadows, the figure by the door, the picture. It had to be a sleep-deprived hallucination, right? But that was wishful thinking. The photo was still on my nightstand. The image of me, asleep with that dark shape in the mirror, etched into my brain. I'd memorized every inch of that photo, noticing details I didn't want to admit were real. Whoever took it, they'd been standing close, way too close. I thought about calling someone, anyone, but what was I going to say? That I'd signed up for a drug trial on the dark web, and now I was hearing voices and finding creepy photos of myself. Yeah, I'd end up in a padded room. So instead, I did what any rational person wouldn't. I kept going. I mean, it's not like I could just stop now, right? Especially not after that last message. I didn't understand why. but I felt like I had to finish this, like I was being drawn towards something I couldn't explain. So I took the next pill. The metallic taste hit me even stronger this time, lingering in the back of my throat like copper, almost burning as it went down. Immediately, I felt a cold chill settle over me, a creeping numbness spreading through my hands and feet. It was as if my body was going into autopilot, ignoring every instinct screaming at me to stop. I stumbled over to my laptop to log the day's entry, expecting to see that usual form pop up. But this time, there was no form, just a single, blank page with a flashing cursor in the center, a chat box. My hands were trembling as I waited for something, anything, to appear. And then, a message popped up. Describe what you see around you. It felt like a punch to the gut. My eyes darted around my room, the shadows seeming to shift and pulse with every heartbeat. I typed slowly, feeling like I was betraying myself with every word. I'm in my room. Everything looks normal. The response was almost immediate. Look again. I glanced around, dread pooling in my stomach, and that's when I saw it. Something subtle, but unmistakable. My reflection in the mirror by the closet was staring back at me, but it wasn't copying me. While I sat there, frozen, my reflection leaned forward, tilting its head with a slow, unnatural smile spreading across its face. I felt a scream building in my chest, but I clamped my mouth shut, unwilling to let it out, afraid of what else might come if I did. My hands hovered over the keyboard and I managed to type. I see something wrong. Good, the response said. You're progressing. I backed away from my laptop, feeling every hair on my body stand up. My reflection was still watching, the grin on its face so out of place, so wrong. I didn't dare to blink, afraid that if I looked away, it would move, would step out of the mirror and take my place. I turned off the screen, hoping that would end it, but the laptop flickered back on. The chat box was still open. Don't ignore me. My heart was pounding in my ears. I typed back, Who are you? There was a pause, longer this time, and when the answer finally appeared, it was worse than anything I could have imagined. I am you. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at those words. They felt like a cold weight settling in my chest, pinning me in place. It didn't make sense. None of this made sense. But I knew somehow that what I was reading was the truth. This thing, whatever it was, had become a part of me. I could feel it, like a second heartbeat, pulsing somewhere deep within me, whispering, laughing. That night, I decided I couldn't stay in my apartment. I packed a bag, grabbed my keys, and left, trying to ignore the feeling that my reflection was watching me, following me down the hall. I ended up at a cheap motel on the other side of town, the kind of place where no one asks questions. I figured I'd lay low, clear my head, and maybe the drug would start to wear off. Maybe whatever was happening would fade if I just got some distance. But it didn't. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of scratching. Soft, deliberate, coming from just outside my motel door. I held my breath, straining to hear. The scratching stopped. And then, slowly, I heard the sound of something pressing against the door, like a hand sliding down its surface. My pulse was thundering in my chest, and I lay perfectly still, afraid to make a sound. Then a voice whispered from the other side, a low, chilling murmur, familiar but distorted. You can't run from yourself. I sat there, frozen, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. Slowly, I reached for my phone, trying to call someone, anyone. But the screen stayed dark, refusing to turn on, like it had been drained of life. I felt trapped, suffocating, the walls closing in around me. The whispering continued, this time closer, like it was right next to my ear. I could barely make out the words, but it was my voice, repeating the same phrase over and over. You can't hide. You can't hide. You can't hide. I squeezed my eyes shut, clutching my knees to my chest, praying that if I didn't respond, it would stop. But when I opened my eyes, I saw something that nearly made me scream. There, reflected in the small mirror across from the bed, was my own face, staring back at me. But my eyes, they weren't my own. They were pitch black, empty, a void that seemed to swallow the light around it. And that twisted smile was still there, wider, more sinister, stretching impossibly across my face. My reflection mouthed the words, slowly, deliberately, "Let me in." I slammed my eyes shut, my mind racing, every nerve screaming at me to get out. I stumbled out of bed, grabbed my bag and ran out of that motel as fast as I could, the echo of my own laughter following me down the hall. I kept running until my legs gave out, collapsing on a park bench in the middle of the night, gasping for breath. As I sat there, heart pounding, I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. With shaking hands, I pulled it out, hoping, praying it was someone normal, someone who could help me. But it was a notification from the drug trial team. "Return home. You're almost ready." I dropped the phone, feeling a cold dread settle over me. There was nowhere left to run. I didn't know where to go. I sat on that park bench for what felt like hours, just staring at the shadows, watching for any movement, any hint that it, or I, might follow. My mind raced through a million thoughts, but I kept coming back to one. I was losing control. Whatever I'd taken, whatever this compound 53 was, it was inside me now, a part of me, feeding on my thoughts, twisting them, making me see things that couldn't be real. But each time I tried to convince myself that I was imagining it, that voice whispered in my head, reminding me that running wouldn't change anything. Eventually, the message from the trial team got to me. "Return home. You're almost ready." I couldn't stand the thought of going back to that dark, suffocating apartment, of seeing that face in the mirror, but something stronger than fear was pulling me back. It was as if some invisible thread was guiding me, tugging at me to go home, to finish what I'd started. When I got back, the place looked different. Not physically, but in some intangible way. Everything seemed darker, like a shadow had crept into every corner, lurking, watching. My reflection in the entryway mirror seemed to follow me, its eyes lingering even after I'd turned away. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I'd get through the night and figure something out in the morning. But that was a lie I could barely convince myself of. The worst part was, my body felt numb. It was a strange, unsettling sensation, like I wasn't fully there. My limbs felt heavy, as if I was walking through water. I couldn't even feel my heartbeat, just an odd, pulsing vibration, steady, mechanical, echoing in my head. As I walked to my room, I saw the laptop open on my desk, the screen glowing softly. I hadn't touched it since leaving, and I'd left it turned off. But the screen was on, the cursor blinking, as if it was waiting for me. I sat down, more out of compulsion than choice, and stared at the screen. A new message appeared in the chat box. "Almost complete. Final phase beginning now." My hands moved on their own, typing a reply without my permission. "What does that mean?" There was a pause, and then the response appeared, each word feeling heavier than the last. "The separation is almost done." I could feel my stomach twist as I read it, a chill racing down my spine. Separation? What did that even mean? But the moment I thought about it, I knew. I could feel it. This divide splitting me in two. The sense that something within me was tearing away, becoming separate, distinct. Something dark, patient, and eager. I ran to the bathroom, desperate to splash water on my face, to shake this feeling off. But as soon as I looked into the mirror, I froze. There was my reflection, staring back at me. But it wasn't me. Not anymore. The face in the mirror wore my features, but everything was off. My skin was pale, almost translucent, the veins visible beneath, winding like dark roots. My eyes were hollow, the whites stained with streaks of black that pulsed and throbbed, as if something was alive in them. And that grin, that twisted, gleeful smile, stretching across my face in a way no human face should. I watched as my reflection tilted its head, studying me with a look of curiosity, almost pity. Then slowly, it leaned closer, pressing its hands against the glass. I could see the muscles in my own face moving, twitching under the skin, stretching that grin wider and wider until it was almost too horrible to look at. Then it spoke, its voice echoing in my mind, chillingly calm and familiar. You're done running. It's time to let go. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. I could hear the pulse of my own heartbeat echoing louder, drowning out everything else, an overwhelming throb pounding in my ears. My reflection didn't move. It just kept staring, that grin locked in place, as if it knew it had already won. I turned away, desperately trying to steady my breathing. I had to focus, had to think of a way out, but every thought slipped away, replaced by that rhythmic, mechanical pulse. It was as if I was dissolving, every part of me unraveling, slipping away into something darker. Just then, my phone buzzed, breaking the trance. I fumbled for it, barely able to keep my hands steady. It was another message from the drug trial team. Congratulations. Prepare for the final integration. The words sent a shockwave through me. I didn't know what integration meant, but I could feel it. This creeping darkness clawing its way up, wrapping around my mind, pulling me down. I tried to resist, to fight back, but every time I pushed, it pushed harder. And then, I stopped fighting. I don't know why. Maybe I was tired. Maybe the drug had stripped away my willpower. Or maybe I just realized I couldn't win. But the moment I stopped struggling, everything fell silent. The pulse faded, my mind cleared, and I felt at peace. For a second anyway. Then I felt it. This rush of cold searing through my veins, like ice water flooding my system. My body was moving, but I wasn't the one in control. I could feel my limbs moving, but it was as if I was a passenger in my own body, watching as something else took the wheel. I could see through my eyes, but they weren't mine. They belonged to it, the thing that had been watching me, waiting for this moment. I walked to the mirror, watching as my reflection smiled, satisfied, content. But I wasn't the one smiling. I was trapped, locked inside, watching helplessly as my own face grinned back at me, mocking me. The thing wearing my skin raised a hand, giving a little wave, as if to say goodbye. I felt my heart racing, panic clawing at me, but there was nothing I could do. I was stuck, like a shadow, buried somewhere deep inside, unable to move, unable to scream. Then the reflection leaned in close, its mouth inches from the glass, and whispered one final message, just for me. It's my turn now. And just like that, everything went black. When I woke up, I wasn't in my apartment anymore. The ceiling above me was unfamiliar. A harsh, fluorescent light, humming cold and sterile, flickering like it might go out at any second. I blinked, disoriented, my mind fuzzy, but then the memories came rushing back, each one more horrifying than the last. The drug trial, the messages, the mirror, the thing that had taken control. I tried to sit up, but my arms and legs wouldn't respond. It felt like they'd been strapped down, held in place by something I couldn't see. Panic shot through me as I looked around, realizing I was lying on some kind of metal table in what looked like a small, windowless room. The walls were pale grey, bare and cold, and the only sound was the low, mechanical hum of that light overhead. As my vision adjusted, I noticed a camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling, its red light blinking steadily. Whoever had put me here was watching, and worse yet, they'd planned for me to wake up like this. Suddenly, a screen on the far wall flickered to life. The display was dark at first, but then a message appeared, written in that same eerie, clinical text I'd come to dread. Integration complete. Welcome to Phase 2. I felt bile rise in my throat as I read it. Phase 2? What had Phase 1 even been? Was this whole thing, this dark, twisted experience, just the beginning? I tried to scream, to call out, but my voice was barely a whisper, hoarse and broken. I'd been silent for too long, buried within myself, and now even my voice was unrecognizable. I lay there, heart pounding, trapped in my own body, when I felt it. That familiar, creeping sensation, like someone else was there with me, coiled beneath my skin, waiting. I could feel it moving, stretching, like a snake waking up after a long sleep, adjusting to its new home. The screen changed again, and this time, the message was addressed directly to me. You have completed the merging process. We are pleased with the results. I wanted to scream at them, to tell them that they hadn't merged with anything, that they'd stolen me, that I was trapped, but the words wouldn't come. My thoughts were slipping away, dissolving into static. The panic, the terror, the memories. Everything was fading, replaced by something calm, cold, and empty. Then, like a switch had been flipped, my body started moving. My arms lifted from the table, my legs swung down, and I sat up, all without my control. I could feel it using me, wearing me like a suit, bending me to its will. I was just along for the ride, a spectator in my own body. I looked down at my hands, flexing my fingers one by one, and I knew the thing inside me was testing its new form, feeling its way around. It turned my head toward the screen where another message had appeared. Final instructions uploaded. Complete your task. The thing inside me grinned, and I could feel it reveling in its new power, in the freedom it had stolen. I was screaming, clawing at the walls of my own mind, but it was like I was shouting into a void, unheard and unseen. I felt my legs start to move, guiding me toward the door on the other side of the room. It opened with a quiet hiss, leading into a dimly lit hallway. I recognized nothing, but somehow I knew where I was going. Or rather it knew, dragging me down the corridor, each step bringing a strange, twisted satisfaction to the thing controlling me. It was heading somewhere specific, following some command buried deep within my mind. As we reached the end of the hallway, another door opened, and I stepped into a large, empty room. The walls were lined with monitors, each one showing different scenes. People in their homes, strangers on the street, a few children playing in a park. Each screen flickered with different faces, different lives, and I felt a sickening lurch as I realized what this was. Each screen was someone who'd signed up, just like I had. We were the test subjects, the volunteers, and now we were all being used. In the corner of the room, I spotted a figure standing in the shadows. They were watching me, arms crossed, an air of cold detachment radiating from them. I wanted to confront them, to scream and demand answers, but instead, my mouth curved into a smile. It wasn't me who was smiling, of course. It was the thing inside me, my new passenger. The figure nodded, as if satisfied, and gestured for me to approach. My feet moved on their own, carrying me forward until I stood inches from them. The figure leaned close, close enough for me to feel their breath against my face, and whispered, "Welcome to the real world. You're one of us now." With that, they pressed a small object into my hand, a thin metallic disc, cold and smooth. I couldn't stop my fingers from curling around it, holding it tight. A new set of instructions filled my mind, clear and undeniable. I was to return to my old life, go back to my apartment, my job, my friends, and wait for the signal. And the worst part? Some part of me was excited. As I was led back down the hallway, my mind screamed, begging to be released, to be freed from this nightmare. But I was fading, dissolving, a distant memory sinking into the dark. The thing inside me, this new me, had taken over completely, and it felt nothing but anticipation for what was to come. When I finally returned to my apartment, everything looked the same, yet somehow different, like I was seeing it for the first time, with new eyes. I went to the mirror, staring at my own reflection, and there it was, that smile, wide and twisted, stretching across my face. I held up the metallic disc, feeling its cold weight in my hand, and then placed it on the edge of my dresser like an offering. It was a reminder, a promise of what I'd become, and somewhere, buried deep inside, I could still feel myself, a faint whisper drowned by the darkness, knowing that this was my life now, a shadow, watching, waiting, trapped inside the thing that had stolen my face, my mind, my very soul. It looked back at me through the mirror, and as I smiled, I knew that the person I'd been was gone, and all that remained was this hollow shell, ready for whatever task it had been made to complete. I signed up for a trial, hoping for a way out, a way to escape my life. But now I was trapped, living a new one, and whatever this thing was inside me, it was just getting started.